everyone, and welcome to week 4 of our Mars Hill Exchange. And so enjoyed the conversations over the last couple weeks in April. It's been, we began this month, and it was, I believe it was the Baylor versus Gonzaga basketball night, that first Monday. And here we are now. May is upon us, and summer and graduation for a lot of colleges. My kids are finishing up their college semester at Baylor, and I'm finishing up mine here at Palm Beach Atlantic. And so excited for what's, the change and things like that. But thank you so much for joining us. And for those of you who have been here before, the format should be fairly pretty familiar. We're basically gonna take about a half hour to hear from our speaker, give or take, and then we'll do another half hour or so of Q&A just based on the topic of the discussion. So anyway, there's in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a little chat box where you can put your questions. And so anytime during the lecture, as questions come up, just throw them in there. And then when Dr. Ortlund is gone, or done with his talk, we'll start working through those. So, okay. So with that, my name again is Paul Gould, and I'm your host of the Mars Hill Exchange and also a professor of philosophy at Palm Beach Atlantic University, and care deeply about just this question: how does the gospel get a fair hearing in the culture? And of course, the church has got to be part of that story. And so that's why we're doing this month with the Mars Hill Exchange, just asking the question: how do we as the church present the brilliance and the beauty of the gospel and Jesus? And so this week, I'm very excited to have with us Gavin Ortlund. Hello, Gavin. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so we're going to hear from Gavin. He's going to speak on apologetics for a new generation. So I'm very excited to hear from Gavin. If you don't know about him, Gavin did his PhD at Fuller Seminary, and he's a pastor and he's a scholar. So he's, I think, one of those unique blends of both. He's a senior pastor at a church in Ojai, California. And he's also the author of a number of books, one of which, his latest book, will be coming out on October 26th. And it's a book with the title, Why God Makes Sense in a World That Doesn't. And I actually love the subtitle of the book is The Beauty of Christian Theism. And so I'm really excited, love to hear more about that book and excited for that to come out, Gavin. But in addition to that, he's written on things like retrieving Augustine's doctrine of creation. So you might have questions about that. That could be really interesting. What does Augustine have to say about, the doctrine of creation today? But I have a feeling that Gavin might have a few things to say there, as well as other titles of some of his works: Theological Retrieval for Evangelicals, and then Finding the Right Hill to Die On, the case for theological triage, another important topic. And you can find out more about Gavin. He blogs at his website at gavinortland.com. Okay, so with that, let's pass it over to Gavin. I'm going to mute myself, and Gavin, you can take it away for the next part of the time.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul, and great to be with everybody. I know we've had a lot of Zoom over the last year or so, so I'm just grateful for you taking the time to do one more. And I'm really excited to talk about this topic, which is very important to my heart. I've had a lot of friends who have left the Christian faith. There's a lot of talk about spiritual deconstruction right now. And some of the friends that I've had who have left the Christian faith, was shocked. I did not anticipate, had no sense that they were maybe wrestling or anything like that. And so it's just been on my mind for a number of years now. And then I've been through my own process of working through questions and times of searching through difficult questions of the faith and that kind of thing. I've found apologetics to be an enormous relief. And so I've been on this about 2.5 years now, this process of studying and just finding it. It's like you blow open the windows for spring cleaning and the fresh air comes in. It's how apologetics has felt for me. It's just so helpful. But I also have come to the conviction that we maybe need to not completely change, but just think about, are there maybe some differences of emphasis for how we go about doing apologetics right now, especially with the rising generation. And I'm especially thinking in our context here in the United States. So I'm sure this could apply for other places. I just don't have as much knowledge of other places in the world. But for and especially for not exclusively, but especially for evangelicals. So younger evangelicals in the United States, are there ways we can go about apologetics that are maybe a little different? Well, I want to suggest maybe that there are three things that we can be thinking about, and I'll get to those in a second. Let me set it up like this. I want to start with a quote from Hans Urs von Balthasar, who was a Roman Catholic theologian. And one of the things that he's famous for is thinking about the role of beauty in theology. Why is beauty important in the task of theology? In the context of that, he said this: the first thing that must strike a non-Christian about the Christian's faith is that it obviously presumes far too much. It is too good to be true. Now, I have been turning that quote over in my mind over and over as I've been doing my research for my book that Paul mentioned, and then just thinking about these topics, especially comparing Christianity and naturalism. So naturalism is the philosophy that there is nothing other than physical nature. Looking at those two worldviews in particular, which I think are probably the two main options that a lot of younger people in our culture are wrestling with, though not the only options. What von Balthasar is saying is, if the non-Christian really hears what the Christian is saying, the instinctive response will be, oh, that's way too happy. That's way too joyful. That's way too triumphant. That's way too good. It's way too beautiful. Can't be that good. Reality can't be that happy, you know? Now, obviously, a statement like that could be taken too far to downplay the difficult things that a Christian will say in the context of apologetics or evangelism, about repentance, for example, about taking up our cross and following Jesus. But I think there's something that is nonetheless profoundly true about what von Balthasar said, and I think it's really needed right now. I have a sense that there's a lot of disenchantment and a lot of anxiety and a lot of angst among the younger generation, and an appeal to beauty is very important. So I want to identify what we'll do here is I'll walk through just three ways we might think about this. And I'm going to be brief. I'm going to, I know our attention spans on Zoom aren't infinite. So I'll be brief. And then I want to save a lot of time for Q&A. But, and I'll just mention too, so the book that I have coming out, if you're interested, if anything I say is of interest to you, you could, you might be interested in the book, which comes out in October, When God Makes Sense of a World That Doesn't. You also might be interested, I have a YouTube channel called Truth Unites. I just put out a video last Friday on my own process of spiritual deconstruction and how I went through that and ultimately came out on the other side with a stronger faith. And apologetics, again, played a huge role in that. So if you're interested in that, you could check out, just go to YouTube and type in Gavin Ortlund spiritual deconstruction or something like that, and you can pull up that video. Two other caveats I'll say very quickly is, number one, I believe that we must listen to the Holy Spirit when we are doing apologetics. So everything I say should be relativized under that reality, that this is a spiritual process, that it's not mechanical, there's no formula. And then secondly, I want to say that any other question of apologetics strategy has to have this in mind as well, that each person is different. Each person needs to be treated as a person, individually, personally. Francis Schaeffer used to say, if I have an hour with someone, I'll spend the first 55 minutes asking questions and only the last 5 minutes presenting Christ. And he said that because everyone has different objections and concerns, and the gospel does not change, but it can be expressed with nuance and contextualization for particular people. So there's not one right way to do apologetics, but there's certain needs in our culture right now. And so I want to talk about three things we might consider. Number one, appealing to beauty. And this is from the von Balthasar quote, but let me comment on this by referencing the philosopher Blaise Pascal. If you've ever heard of Blaise Pascal, his pensée or thoughts are really worth reading. If you read anything in the realm of apologetics, I really encourage, and you can get a great edition that's edited by Peter Kreeft, the great philosopher, and he's got his own comments that are also really interesting to read. But in Pascal's pensée, he has one of them that says this: Men despise religion. They hate it and are afraid it might be true. And he's really thinking of Christianity specifically, I think. The cure for this is, first, show that religion is not contrary to reason, but worthy of reverence and respect. Next, make it attractive, make good men wish it were true, and then show that it is. And again, this has been one of those quotes that's just been on my mind all the time in the context of working on my book. He says there's a threefold strategy. So he says, first, make Christianity respectable. Second, make it desirable. And third, show people that it's true. And I think about that a great deal because I think that a lot of the approaches to apologetics of previous generations tend to start with step 3, where you're just interested in just right off the bat, here's why it's true. And I think there's a kind of practical wisdom and even a psychological kind of insight in Pascal's comment, because what he says there at the beginning, men are afraid it might be true. I think that's true. I think whenever in every dialogue, there's a little bit of the other party that might be wondering, what if they're right? And the ability, so if you just start at what is true, you're not hitting the whole person, and you may be losing an opportunity to disarm them a little bit. So it's fascinating that he talks about all 3 of those stages. I think a lot of people are at stage 1, and that's where books like Tim Keller's Making Sense of God, his follow-up to The Reason for God, and Rebecca McLaughlin's Confronting Christianity are so helpful because they're dealing right there at the gate, assuming that the other party doesn't even think religion is worth talking about. And you have to start there. You have to say, here's why it's even worth thinking about this. But then that second stage is really important, helping people feel the implications and the beauty that is at stake. And this has been my own experience, which I passionately believe others, I'm probably not alone in this, that if you're wrestling with Christianity and naturalism, these two, and you end up decisively emerging from naturalism into Christianity, you say, okay, I actually believe that Jesus did rise from the dead. I wasn't sure if there's a God, but now I'm committed. What that feels like is good news. And, we have to remember that the gospel means good news. And my own experience has been, it's felt like going through the wardrobe into Narnia, because it feels like you go from a worldview that is more cramped and restricted into a worldview that's much more expansive, and sort of that feeling like anything is possible. And I think if we can help people feel something of that, of the larger implications with respect to human desire, and I'll say more about this in specifics in a few moments, that is really helpful in the task of apologetics. Now, obviously, beauty in and of itself isn't enough. So this is a both and. We need to give arguments that it's true and that it's beautiful. But this idea that we have to show that the gospel is both true and beautiful and good. These are the 3 transcendentals that the Greek philosophers used to speak about: the true, the good, and the beautiful. This is a classic Christian instinct. This is the historic way of presenting the gospel. All 3 of these things. Here's another quote from von Balthasar. He says, "In a world that no longer has enough confidence in itself to affirm the beautiful, the proofs of the truth have lost their cogency. Syllogisms may still dutifully clatter away like rotary presses or computers, which infallibly spew out an exact number of answers by the minute. But the logic of these answers is itself a mechanism which no longer captivates anyone." And I have some other quotes to this effect that I think are very insightful, that are saying, if all you do is truth and you don't show that it's beautiful, it comes across to people today kind of like with a shrug. Let me just mention 3 ways right now in our culture where I think we especially need beauty. And this first point, the beauty, is going to be my main comment here. The other 2 are very brief. But one is that there's a lot of disillusionment and disenchantment right now. And Kierkegaard used to talk about how you have to use indirect communication. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard he wrote different kinds of works. He wrote what he called aesthetic works, and he said, basically, if people are not already asking the question, you have to get their attention. You have to write in these aesthetic categories to arrest the attention. And I have to say, I've known a lot of people where beauty has been what breaks through to actually make them even interested in having the conversation. And beauty's done a lot. I mean, I've known so many people who have come to Christ because they read The Lord of the Rings. And there was a beauty and a glory and just a, for lack of a better word, a solidity in the metaphysics of that work of fiction that is hard to account for within the confines of a naturalistic worldview. There's things you encounter in the Lord of the Rings that start messing with your categories, you know? And in my mind, the arts like literature, music, other things are a very powerful tool we have right now to try to pierce through that disenchantment and you know, break through the armor a little bit and help people feel that there's a reason to even have the conversation. I also think we live in an age of distraction. You know, so much of the enemy sometimes for apologetics is not a really good counter argument. The enemy can just be sometimes people are too busy. They're not even thinking about these questions because our lives are filled with distractions. And Pascal, of course, has this famous quote where he says, the sole cause of our unhappiness is that we don't know how to stay quietly in our room. And I used to think that that was kind of a funny statement, but kind of an overstatement. But I think I actually know what he's talking about. He was saying, if we were forced to sit still in our room, we'd have to deal with reality. We'd have to deal with what's going on in our profound unhappiness, our profound sense of malaise. And, you know, it forced us to kind of take stock of our life. But we fill our lives with diversions and distractions as a way to kind of cover over the spiritual emptiness that we often feel. At least that was Pascal's perspective, and I find that pretty compelling. And I think a lot of people in our culture, we're so busy and distracted. So I think beauty can also pierce through that, just like the disillusionment. Beauty has this way of traveling at a wavelength that everybody can understand. And it has a way of kind of opening up the door a little bit for our communication with people. And then the last thing I'd say is I think that we live in a time of polarization and outrage. And a lot of people have moral concerns more than intellectual concerns with the gospel. I talked with a Christian apologist a few years ago who said, on college campuses, I used to get more questions about truth, like, does God exist? Did Jesus rise from the dead? Now I get more questions about goodness, like, is Christianity homophobic? And has the church persecuted other groups? Does religion make you less tolerant? You know, those kinds of questions. Those are so if all we do is talk about truth, we may not be hitting at these other questions that are so throbbing right now in our culture. Our culture is very morally outraged about things. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're a more conservative or more progressive person. Everybody is outraged, it seems. And you know, if a gospel appeal that can show the gospel to be not merely true and plausible, but also actually hopeful, good, life-giving, breaking off the shackles, you know, freeing, humane, that appeal will be far more far-reaching in our cultural moment right now. So for all those reasons, I think beauty is really, really important in the context of apologetics, helping people say something like this: wow, I'm not sure if Jesus rose from the dead or not yet. Not sure if it's true. But if he did, that's the happiest thing I can possibly imagine. Okay. I think if we can help people feel that, that's really helpful in the context of, and I think we have every reason to make that appeal, because Jesus rising from the dead is really happy news when you stop and think about it. Think about what that means in the face of death. Think about what that means in our struggle for individual human rights. And I can say more about all that flows out from there. Let me say a few other things though. So that's the first thing that I think in our culture right now is really helpful and useful, is to make an appeal to beauty in the context of apologetics. Okay, let me mention two others. Number two is story and narrative. Now, again, this can be overdone. I'm not trying to come in with a total correction where it's like, we've been going in this way, now we need to go 180 degrees in this way. It's just something to think about, food for thought about how we exactly approach things. Alistair McGrath has a book called Narrative Apologetics, and he talks about basically using stories in the context of presenting the gospel. But what I mean by narrative is actually even bigger. I mean helping people see that Christianity is a story. So in my book, I recast classical arguments in terms of narrative. So the cosmological argument is the start of the story. The Argument from design, teleological argument, the word wasn't coming to me. Teleological argument is the meaning of the story. The moral argument is the drama of the story. And the Christological argument, which by that I mean the Lord, liar, lunatic, or legend argument on the one hand, and then the argument from the resurrection on the other, basically arguing for God from Jesus and his life. That's the hope of the story. And I say every story has these four things. It has an author, a meaning, a drama or struggle, conflict, and a hope, an ultimate denouement or an ultimate terminating point. And that's one way to actually reframe these classical arguments, I think. And I think putting things in terms of story can be helpful because stories tend to be how human beings have always made sense of reality. One person said, there have been great societies that did not use the wheel, but there have been no societies at all that did not tell stories. And I think movies are our culture's maybe dominant form of storytelling. Movies are really big. Even though the Oscars viewing was down this year, I'm told, but 58% from last year, which is pretty amazing. But people still love movies. People are always going to watch movies. Well, movies are a way of making sense of reality. And Christians have put a great deal of thought into our capacity and our interest in stories. Dorothy Sayers said that this is at the heart of what it means to be made in God's image, that we tell stories. J.R.R. Tolkien said the same thing. It's this idea of subcreation that basically our tendency for storytelling mirrors the story. And I think if we can help position people to experience the gospel as a meta narrative, there's lots that can come out of that. I think it can help deal with objections in relation to the problem of evil. I think it can be a more invitational appeal. It can be a little more winsome. In the book, I give 7 arguments for why narrative can be powerful in the context of apologetics, but I'll just leave it there for now. Let me say my last comment. My last, you can tell I'm trying to go fast here so we can save lots of time for Q&A, because I always think Peter Kreeft once said, dialogue is more interesting than monologue because God is a Trinity. And I always think about that whenever I'm starting into a lecture is how can we make it back and forth if possible? So, but the third thing I do in my book is I use what are called abductive arguments more than deductive or inductive arguments. And abduction is a different form of logical inference. So in deduction, you start with premises and then reason to the conclusion, and the conclusion is certain. Inductive reasoning is similar, but the conclusion isn't certain, it's just probable. Abductive reasoning works in the opposite direction. You start with a present set of conditions, and then you simply infer to the best explanation. So it's perhaps even a weaker form of logical inference than induction, certainly than deduction, but it's still useful. So like an example of abductive reasoning is you have a roommate who loves Wendy's. You wake up in the morning one day and you see there's a Wendy's, half-eaten Wendy's food on the counter. You can abduce, well, it was probably from my roommate. But that's not a logically guaranteed conclusion. You know, it's the most likely explanation probably, but it's not certain. And I like to use abductive arguments, little pointers. So in the book, I have an argument for God from math and an argument for God from music. And I say, here's the nature of how we experience music. What's the best explanation? And the argument basically says there's a sense of transcendence we feel when we listen to music. And then I say, here's how a naturalistic framework, which uses evolutionary psychology, can explain that. And basically our brains are tricking us. And then here's how a theistic framework can explain that. And there you're into talking about a Christian philosophy, a theistic philosophy of music. And I'm saying, which is better? Which is more satisfying? Which is more plausible? Similarly with math. So I like to use abductive arguments. I think they're a little bit, I don't know, again, there's not just one right way to do things. So I'm not trying to say this is deep, but this is just my own personal approach. And I think it probably has some resonance with our culture right now for a couple of reasons. One is that it's a little bit less bracing. People sometimes less is more. Again, it depends on the person. But for some people, they actually are a little more willing to give you a hearing if you're saying, not here's what you must accept on pain of inconsistency or on pain of being illogical, but rather you're saying, what's the best way to think about it? And you give people an escape hatch, you know. And also just sometimes those arguments can allow you to not have to be an expert. They can allow you to have a little bit, because like when you're dealing with the cosmological argument, you start off thinking, oh, this is going to be easy. I'll just talk about how the universe doesn't just pop into existence from nothing. That should be obvious. And then you get into it and you're talking about, a no boundary proposal. And you're like, what's that again? I can't, and you're getting into all this really technical knowledge that's at the intersection of cosmology and philosophy. And it's really technical. And an abductive argument might allow you to be more modest in your approach based upon your own training, because I'm not a cosmologist. And so I like to use those arguments, and it can protect you a little bit from criticism. And there's a lot more I could say about abductive arguments too, but that's a little bit. So those are three distinctives of the approach I take in this book and that I think are useful in our culture right now. It's worth thinking about, how can we show the gospel as a story? How can we show that the gospel speaks to the human longing for meaning and coherence? How can we show that it's beautiful? And how can we point to things within our world and infer to the gospel? And that using abductive arguments, and that can sometimes open up a broader array of things. Like, I mentioned music and math. Those are my favorite two arguments for God. They're not the strongest arguments, but they're my favorite. I don't think they're the strongest. I mean, there's ways you can evade them. Again, they're abductive, but they're interesting. And there are certain people for whom that might actually have greater purchase than, an appeal to fine tuning and the physical constants of the universe or something like that. So in my book, I talk a lot about the cosmological argument. I talk a lot about Lawrence Krauss and why I don't think we have a universe from nothing. So I disagree with him. I talk a lot about fine-tuning arguments, but then I kind of quickly pivot into these specific areas. I give an argument from math, an argument from music, and an argument from love. And then the main bulk of it is a moral argument, an abductive moral argument. Claiming that God is both the best explanation for the objectivity of moral values and duties, which is a kind of standard moral argument, but then going one step further and saying it's also a much happier worldview because it allows you for the possibility of a happy ending, as opposed to the story that naturalism tells where there's no happy ending. And it's really actually hard to ground values like individual rights and human equality and things like that. And then I give the Christological argument, arguing from Jesus. I'll close with this, and then so we can leave time with questions. There's a passage in the Silver Chair, one of the Chronicles of Narnia, where the character Puddleglum is stuck underground with several of his friends, and there's an evil sorcerer who's trying to convince them that there is no above the ground, and there's no Aslan, who's the Christ figure in those books. And some of you are maybe familiar with this passage. It's one of my favorite passages in all of literature, and I am not ashamed to quote from it, even though it's a children's book, because I actually think it's very profound. And basically, Puddleglum is saying, if we only dreamed up those things, if there's no sun, there's no trees, there's no sky, all there is the black dirt around us and these little tiny lights, then the real world isn't as great as the one we made up. And basically, he gets to a point where emotionally, I'm paraphrasing here, he says, I'm for that world even if it doesn't exist. And I quote that at the end of the introduction kind of as a summary of my approach and the kind of appeal that I think for many people in our culture has a real power right now. And I don't think Puddleglum is saying it doesn't matter what's true, it only matters what is beautiful. I don't think he's saying that. Rather, I think he's saying something more like this. It's unlikely that this is true because of how beautiful the overworld is, if that makes sense. In other words, he's not saying, okay, you're right, there is no overworld, but I'm just going to keep believing anyway. I think he's saying, I wouldn't believe in you, in your world, even if you were right. And that may well suggest you're not right, if that makes sense. Again, so it's the beauty and the truth that trying to go together there. And I just think that the sentiments that Puddleglum references there, and in his letters, C.S. Lewis's references that as an ontological argument, which is kind of interesting. But I think the sentiment that Puddleglum expresses there is resonant with what I'm sensing is useful to do in our culture right now. Think of it like this: take naturalism. Okay, there's nothing beyond physical nature. Think that through for its full implications for what that means for the meaning of our lives, the moral struggle of our lives, and the ultimate hope of our lives. And it's the more you think about it, I'm convinced, we can talk about this in the Q&A, it's a more cramped and restricted worldview that really does not offer hope. And the more I think about it, the more it kind of makes me feel like Puddleglum. That can't be it. You know, there's got to be more to it than that. Surely we're not continually in every movie you ever see, which is presenting moral drama, good versus evil, and it feels significant. Surely we're not just making up stories that are greater than the actual world that we're in. Surely, what a puzzling thought that a universe that has no meaning would produce us creatures that are obsessed with meaning. And I think Puddleglum's appeal, actually, though it's not the only thing to do in apologetics, actually has its place and may have a place right now in our culture in a particularly vivid and poignant way. So, the end. Thanks for listening to that. Let's dialogue a little bit and see what questions you guys have.
All right. Thank you so much, Gavin. That was really, really helpful, and actually super encouraged. The questions that have already come in are going to take us in like various different directions. So I'm super excited. And then I've got a bunch of questions of my own. And I love, I'm really excited for your book. I love the posture. I think it's really freeing. You know, that like the abductive idea and what best explains these things. There's a kind of humility there that I think is really powerful in today's sort of rage-based culture. And so I'm really excited for just the whole general approach and the emphases on goodness, truth, and beauty. So really, really encouraged by that. I'm going to jump in because there's some great questions, and then I might intersperse some of my own, but let's just get started. Thank you, everyone. If you've got questions, go ahead and just throw them in the dialogue box, and I'll start working through them. So, okay, Gavin, here you go. Let's start with what is beauty?
Okay. Well, this comes up in my book a little bit when we're talking about mathematical beauty, and it's actually really hard to define beauty. Yeah. So there's like these philosophical definitions people give about conformity of the parts in the whole, fittingness among the different parts as they make up a whole. And, you know, so people have, we could talk about kind of more formal definitions, but I maybe what I could say is in the context of apologetics, what I especially have in mind is a presentation of the gospel such that it arrests the heart, it speaks to human need and desire, and it leaves people saying, "Ooh, wow, that's really wonderful." That's kind of in the vein of what I'm thinking in this context, in the appeal to beauty, if that helps at all.
It's something that you know, and it has an effect on us when you see it or when you hear it or experience it. Yeah, and it transports us. Okay, good. Yeah, you're right. I know that we started with a nice hard one there. Okay, this is a great practical question. I love this. How would you advise someone who is going into the world of screenwriting on how they can exhibit apologetics in their work without being too abrasive or indifferent? Great question, especially if you know the storytelling nature of Hollywood.
It is such a great question, and it's so encouraging to think of Christians going into those fields, because it seems to me that sometimes Christians avoid a field like that, and we think of, you know, the arts is an area in general that we can neglect, and I think that's a real shame. So it's wonderful to think of Christians entering into those. And just one thing I could say to this is just how important it is for Christians to enter into all the different spheres of our culture, and this would be a really important area. The only thought that immediately comes to mind is not trying to be, and I sense the sensitivity in the question being asked with the word of not being abrasive. Sometimes Christians could be heavy-handed, you know, like inserting, we've all seen Christian films or things that it can come across as a little bit cheesy or heavy-handed or ham-fisted. It's just it's trying too hard and it's too clunky. And so the feeling that comes to my mind is kind of, don't be afraid of subtlety. It doesn't necessarily, it can be something that, it's like the Lord of the Rings, we talked about. It's not like the Lord of the Rings has this kind of obvious reference to the gospel in it or something like that. It's more the whole texture of the whole thing. So I don't want to say someone should never try to use allegory or something like that, but I just was, the thought of being careful and being not being too heavy-handed is one piece of counsel that might apply.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think that's right. I know that Lewis, I think for Tolkien, it was the Christianity just bubbled up, just couldn't help it. And then for Lewis, it was he was a little more explicit with the allegory, but both of those are like, there's freedom in that. And so I loved your thoughts on that. Good. Okay, here's another great question. Other than the Lord of the Rings, what art and literature do you recommend to create a sense of re-enchantment?
My congregation gets weary of me using illustrations from C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. Well, I actually, no one's ever said that to me, but that sometimes a few people kind of laugh at me when I get to the point in my sermon where I say, C.S. Lewis once said. So I have to apologize and say, I have to say I tend to default to Lewis and Tolkien so much, and I just recognize that's probably my own deficiency. I probably need to read more, but I have just found them to be enjoyable in ways that I haven't experienced others. I have made efforts to really engage in kind of literature, and one author that's really hard to get into, but I made the effort, and he really repaid a lot, is the Russian writer Dostoevsky. Now, this is heavy duty, so I mean, this would be no light weekend reading, but his books, his novels are filled with such a psychological depth and insight. He really understands the human heart. And I have gone back to one of his books in particular again and again, and it's repaid that effort I put in. So I'm a big believer in classical literature, and I only regret I don't have a longer list of recommendations. I have to apologize for that.
It's okay. What's the book by Dostoevsky that you go back to over and over?
The Brothers Karamazov, which is a longer book, and it just is. If you're interested in kind of the question of how atheism and morality are related, so because this is one of the things I get into a lot in the book, is you've got someone like Dostoevsky and the older atheists like Nietzsche and Jean-Paul Sartre, people like that, who they're pushing atheism towards kind of more of a moral despair. And then you've got these newer atheists like Sam Harris, who are atheists, but they're wanting to push it more towards democracy, human rights, reason. And it's worth thinking about, well, who's right, the old atheists or the new atheists? And I'm pretty convinced that the old atheists were more rigorous and consistent, and that Sam Harris and some of the new atheists are borrowing elements from a really a theistic worldview or something more than a naturalistic worldview. So, and I think Dostoevsky draws that out so powerfully through a narrative in that book.
Okay, good. You're motivating me to try it. I've been too scared to try that one.
I did the audio book, so that helped me.
That's a good idea. Yeah, good. Okay, so I got a text coming in too. So I'm working off a couple lists here. How do you see the church playing into all this? So, the kind of advice that you gave, maybe how would that look more at the corporate level?
Okay. And people will, I'll just appreciate people's patience in my answers. I'm not an extremely quick thinker, and I also try to move quickly so we can get to as many questions as possible. So if I don't give a full answer to these, I'll appreciate grace on that, because this is a big question that could go in so many directions. The first thing that comes to my mind is just an awareness as Christians are talking to non-Christians. The Francis Schaeffer quote I mentioned earlier, when he's saying, use the majority of your time to ask questions and exegete the person's heart, because everyone will have different idols and different objections and different struggles and concerns. And that kind of sensitivity to know that we're needing to kind of apply the gospel with a sense of sensitivity to different hearts around us, because the appeal to beauty, I mean, that is a more sensitive and person specific approach sometimes. You know, what someone would like, for example, if someone's a working musician, you might be able to talk with them about their career in certain ways that obviously for someone who isn't a musician, they won't have the same approach. So, and I've had musicians when I give the argument for music for God who respond, and they have different feedback, and it's so interesting to hear what they have to say. So just that kind of sensitivity that, hey, we need to be treating the whole person. We need to be hitting the head and the heart and the will and the imagination, thinking, how does the gospel speak to someone's deep regrets? How does it speak to their pain? And just thinking that first step of just thinking more bigger like that. And then we've done at our church evangelism seminars, evangelism training, just trying to we went through Greg Kokel's book, Tactics, trying to give people some tools of just, hey, here's some questions, because a lot of Christians are afraid of evangelism, trying to demystify it a little bit, just give some tools and some questions and some starting points that can help them in their evangelism. So I think that's something churches can consider doing as well, is what kind of training are we offering for helping with apologetics? Because apologetics is for Christians too. Our people in our churches need this as well, I believe.
Good. Yeah, that's great. Okay, the questions are gonna take you in many different directions here. So next question, what aspect of the gospel do we need to emphasize more to show that it is too good? That whole idea of the hopeful thing. And how do we provoke that kind of reaction?
I really appreciate this question, because it seems to me the kind of thing that we could maybe do poorly. It could be done in a flat-footed kind of way where we're trying too hard or something like that. I can speak from my own experience in preaching and my own experience in my own life as a Christian, to speak to two realities that I think are such incredibly happy news, and that they never grow old, and they're really worth drawing out. One is the doctrine of the forgiveness of sins, which, I'm a Protestant who looks back to Luther and thinks he saw something pretty right on, that the human heart tends to struggle to really believe that that's true. C.S. Lewis said, I'd been a Christian for many years before I really believed in the forgiveness of sins. And I really think that most of Christians, it's a strong statement, but I'll say most Christians are walking around maybe like half-heartedly believing in the forgiveness of sins. And I've been there too, but it's like, do I really believe that God is fully 100% forgiven me and sees me as righteous in his sight because of the work of Christ? Or is he kind of getting weary with me, and is he running low on patience with me? And I think if we can help people see that our Father actually delights to forgive, he's not reluctant in his forgiveness. We don't want to downplay his holiness, his wrath against sin, but the deepest heart of God is a loving, gracious, forgiving heart that delights to forgive. And that's an aspect of the gospel that is so incredibly happy that I don't think it'll ever run out. And we can apply it to ourselves, not only every time we do apologetics, but every single day of our lives to re-enter into that truth. The second and last thing I'd say is the resurrection of Christ. Jesus' resurrection is different from other religions' view of the afterlife because it's a bodily event. So that, and we're told it's the first fruits of our resurrection, and that all of creation is groaning, waiting to be caught up into what God's going to do when Jesus comes back. So we have in Jesus' resurrection, is what I talk about in the book. Think of his body; it still has the holes. It doesn't undo his suffering, but it transforms his suffering into glory. That captures the character of Christian hope. And we were just talking about this on Sunday at my church. The good news of the gospel means, among other things, that our suffering in this life, insofar as it is suffering for Christ, isn't just ended when this life is over, but it's actually transformed into glory. God will actually bring good things out of that. Now, that's the kind of thing I want to think about that for the rest of my life. That is such happy news that God could actually transform our suffering into glory. But I believe that. I think that's what the resurrection of Jesus means. In the book, I quote Samwise Gamgee in Lord of the Rings, is everything sad going to come untrue? If you have this thought, can it really be that good? Then we're getting traction with it, because I do think the resurrection of Jesus means that. It means evil is not merely defeated, evil is turned into glory and good somehow. I don't know if I said that exactly right, but there's a few thoughts.
Yeah. I'm going to skip the same questioner that asked this question. He anticipated some of your answers. So I'm going to go right to him here about this, because I think it's along the same lines of what you said here. What about where you go? What about the core understanding of the cross? Many see it as Jesus satisfying God's wrath. While it may be argued as true and good, I don't see beauty in it. Is there a better understanding of the cross that is more beautiful? So sort of related, but maybe just double click a little on this. Another great question.
Okay. Yeah, here we're getting into atonement theology a little bit. My own understanding is, and I try to take an ironic approach to these things because they're very nuanced, and the atonement, Jesus making us right with God, is a very multifaceted and rich doctrine. I tend to think that there is, as one aspect of the atonement, the solution to the problem of wrath. I don't think that's all that the atonement has to do with, but I do see that. And the reason is, it just seems to me to accord with some of the Old Testament types, the sacrificial system. It seems to accord with some of the passages we have in the New Testament, in Romans 3, and so forth. But I think the atonement is more than just that. But I think that's a key element of it, that God's wrath is, people call it, propitiated or appeased. I can understand how that could maybe not seem beautiful to someone, but maybe at least some of the reasons why could be if it's misunderstood a little bit or caricatured as though God the Father is angry and the Son is stepping in to kind of intervene in a way where the Father and the Son are not aligned with each other. And that would be a caricature, because the gospel is that God the Father himself loves us and sends his Son and is working in concert with the Son. So the wrath is something that is not, it does not divide one member of the Trinity from another. Also, we have to remember that God's wrath is actually a good thing, as difficult as that is to wrap our brains around. I believe that because there's such evil in the world, and a God who didn't feel wrath about it would not be good. But we know that also that God's wrath is not like an impulsive temper tantrum. It is an expression of his holiness and goodness. I like to think of the most loving father you can have. If someone's hurting his child, he's going to be mad, So God's wrath is good. But so maybe it could help people see it as beautiful, if we take away some of the caricatures. And also, if we really do believe that we have sinned and that has created a chasm, a problem between us and God, it is beautiful, I think, to consider that God has bridged that gap by taking that onto himself in the person of Christ. So perhaps we can help people be positioned to see the beauty in it as we try to explain it as best we can.
Well, that's really good. Yeah, I love that. And so much of that is just digging deeper into these rich traditions, and the discussion that's been going on since the early church on the nature of the atonement and things like that. So yeah, I love your answer there. Okay, we're going to take a slightly different direction, but this is something that I wanted to ask you too. And so, how would you help a friend who is deconstructing a bit because of recent political events in the U.S. tied to the church?
Well, I have lots of friends in this category myself. I think the first thing I'd want to say, I won't come at it from a political angle, but from a pastoral angle, is to try to express sympathy and understanding for people who are feeling disillusioned, because there's a lot that's happened in the American church. Even if we just left politics aside for a moment, we could think of pastors and ministers who have fallen or been exposed in some kind of sin. And that's been deeply disillusioning for many of my friends and for me, to be honest. It's been hard. It's like, man, how is this happening so much? And then, there's lots that can make people feel that feeling of disillusionment, and the political environment is one of them too. My main encouragement and where I've gone is to try to step back and distinguish between the things that may need to be deconstructed, that you may need to disentangle, and then the things that you want to hold on to and potentially even reconstruct and just to share again, my video came out last Friday. It's called Spiritual Deconstruction, How My Faith Survived. And I talk about this exact point. I talk about my own struggle in light of larger dynamics within the church related to politics and other things. And I basically say my experience was I did deconstruct some beliefs I had, but I came back and found that the core was stronger through that process. And that's just my testimony. That's just what I experienced. And I would encourage people not to be all or nothing in their thinking. You know, you may, if you have concerns about, you know, because I've met so many people who they grew up in the church and they were hurt by a church. And the last thing in the world I'd want to say to that person is you shouldn't be hurt by that, because maybe it hurt, you know. So I don't want to invalidate someone's concerns, someone's feelings, someone's whatever. But I also want to say, don't be all or nothing. Take it one step at a time. Take each issue on its own, you know? And because I see so many people who they start to deconstruct because of one thing, and then they just, you know, pendulum swing way over to the other side. And so what I encourage people to do is go back to the basics. Go back to, do I believe in God? Okay, that has nothing to do with the American church. You can believe in God and not live in America. You can believe in God and have lived 1,000 years ago before there was America. Okay, so that's a bigger question. Do I believe in God? Do I believe Jesus rose from the dead? You know, go to those and then look at the core, and don't let other things that are more in the peripheral make you deconstruct all the way down to the core. And my experience has been going back to the core. And that's where apologetics has been helpful to me. There's really good reasons to think that our world looks like it was put together and created and designed. And I think there's pretty compelling reasons to believe in Christ and believe in his resurrection. And so apologetics has really helped me in my own process, thinking about this really good question.
Just to follow up on that, because I was curious when you mentioned that apologetics had helped you through your own journey. Any particular works that you found helpful that you could just, you know, pass on to all of us?
Yeah. It's been such an interesting hodgepodge of things, everything from, you know, some standard evangelical apologists like William Lane Craig, and they do such wonderful work, their arguments, to reading literature. And I mentioned Dostoevsky earlier. He helped me, I won't reiterate what I said, but just he helped me think through the implications of atheism for the moral realm and where that leaves you. And I looked down that tunnel, I thought, that isn't good. That doesn't go to a good place. And then, so yeah, literature. Studying the resurrection. So Mike Licona has a really a great book, and there's many other books on this as well that could be looked. Gary Habermas has some books, those kinds of guys. Mike Licona's book is with IVP Academic. I think it's called The Resurrection of Jesus, but I can't remember the title. But Licona, Licona. And I was really impressed. I read him and some on that side, and then I read Bart Ehrman for the other side. And I came out of that and I thought, oh my goodness, the case is so good for trusting in the trustworthiness of the gospel accounts as historical documents. And I came through thinking through, I didn't expect to find a good argument for the resurrection. That's what surprised me. I thought I'd believe that more on faith, but I was amazed that I think there's really compelling arguments for why Jesus' resurrection seems to just fit so well to explain the birth of the Christian movement and what we find in the first century evidence. So I would really encourage people to check out those kinds of arguments as well. Licona's book would be a great one.
What I find so encouraging and interesting about what you just shared is that oftentimes we, like you mentioned a little bit earlier, we think about apologetics as just something for the non-believer, but here you are, someone, you know, further along in the faith, going back to some of these, you know, the contemporary debates and the arguments, but finding comfort and reassurance for your beliefs as a believer. And so that's just really helpful, I think, and freeing for all of us, that it's okay wherever we are, that these things are helpful. So, okay, another question. Which of I don't know if I can say this right, von Balthasar works would you start with?
Okay, let me see. It's right back over my shoulder. uh, he's, I think I always mix up the title of the one volume and the title of the whole set.
Okay.
I think the title of the whole set is called Theodrama. But the first volume in there is called The Glory of the Lord. I think I'm getting that right. And this is not for the faint of heart. He's not one that's real easy to tackle. It's a lengthy book and it's pretty heavy duty stuff. So if you want to get into him, I would say just be prepared. It's going to be some tough sledding a little bit there. But I would, if I was the questioner, I'd go to Amazon and just find within his set, the Theodrama, which particular theological topics am I most interested in? If it's beauty, then that first volume of The Glory of the Lord would be a great starting point.
Okay. Very good. Very helpful. Okay. As a pastor, how would you approach enchanting your congregation? Have you found resistance when appealing to the beautiful as opposed to just the good or the true among those in the church?
I haven't experienced too much resistance. I have anticipated that and been alert to that possibility. In my own mind, I have a couple of those worries that come up that I try to attend to and pay attention to. I think I mentioned at the very beginning, but one of the worries would be, well, if you emphasize the happiness of the gospel so much, are you going to downplay the difficult, more bracing parts of the gospel about sin and repentance and taking up our cross and following Jesus? That's a real live worry. It can be done. So my attitude is, we should be, I haven't experienced a lot of resistance to that yet. I can see how that could come. I do think that's a danger that's a valid concern that we should be alert to. This could be done in a formulaic way, or it could be done in a way that downplays, it just makes it sound, because we could be so eager to just, want people to respond to the gospel that we're not helping them count the cost. And Jesus taught that we should help people count the cost when they make a commitment to Christ. So I want to, talk about beauty in a way that's sensitive to that dynamic. For the how part of the question, this is kind of one of the ways we could think about that is, how do we balance those concerns? And well, one practical thing for me that always helps me is to follow the scripture. So I preach through books of the Bible. As I'm preaching, I just try to let the tone of the text direct me. And there's many texts in the New Testament that are celebratory, and there's many texts in the scripture that are lamenting or that are warning. And so it helps me in my sermon prep to think, if I were setting this passage to music, what would the music sound like? Would it be suspenseful, or would it be, triumphant? And so I try to have the tone of the text influence me. So that way I'm not preaching a real triumphant message every single Sunday, but I'm trying to kind of let the scripture guide me so we get all the nuances of how the gospel should play out. So that's one practical thing. And then just trying to be accurate in our theology. So just, the other questioner helpfully brought up the cross. We want to talk about the cross, but we also want to talk about the resurrection and emphasizing both. We want to talk about faith, but we also want to talk about repentance. Those are both, and just trying to make sure we're not getting lopsided in what we're focusing on theologically.
Okay, good. As a pastor, I'm just curious to follow up on that. Have you experimented with blending ideas and image or maybe art into the service, or have you considered, the role of the embodiment and place in the sanctuary? Have you thought to incorporate any of that in, whether it's a church worship service or, beyond at all in this way?
I have been thinking about this a lot. I've been thinking about it more than I've found out what I should do about it. So I'm sort of still working on it. One of the things I've been thinking about is the sacraments. Do we need to be having a richer practice of the Lord's Supper? Because Jesus gave us that as a physical thing. And so my church is more kind of low church, more kind of casual in our style. And I don't think there's one right style, so that's fine. But any style can find ways of trying to do things in a way that have kind of an aesthetic sensitivity. And so that's one thing I've been thinking about is, whether it be the Lord's Supper or because I read a lot of church history. That's kind of my area of formal training is historical theology. So there's, the old debate about icons, wherever you land on that in the Eastern Church. There's some of the arguments, whatever you think about that specific issue, there's principles there of, or just thinking of some traditions. I'm a Baptist, but many other traditions have done better probably than I have done, certainly, at thinking about church architecture and how does that meet the eye, and how does it, because some church architecture is so amazing at drawing the eye upward to contemplate the glory of God. I don't have answers on this, but I think all of that is valid, and all of that needs to be thought through in a way that's specific to each church, but it's totally a valid area that we need to think about. How are we appealing to the full person in the way we do things?
Okay, good. All right, next question. So I'm noticing a trend toward pantheism, New Age spirituality among friends who might earlier have identified as atheists. That's interesting. Some of this has to do with, I think, experiences they've had through drug use. In these cases, arguments against naturalism or even in favor of a creator have become declawed to some extent. So how would we make Christ central in our apologetic to a generation whose rejection of God itself is post-Christian? Does that make sense? I can try to
Yeah.
rephrase that.
No, makes total sense. And I have to say, I minister in a place that would be, yeah, I think Paul and I were emailing about Ojai one time, and yeah, it's a challenging culture. I minister in I would say, one of the most challenging places missiologically, because it's a more rural area. It's a spiritually dark area. It's a shrinking area because it's getting so expensive to live here. The families are moving. And it's also a very kind of spiritual, but not religious area, which I think kind of connects in some ways with this question about people who believe in spirituality. That's Ojai. Ojai is not like, Cambridge, Massachusetts or something where it's a more hardened opposition to, it's maybe a little bit more of just atheistic to some extent, maybe more thoroughly secular. Here, it's kind of more of a smorgasbord spirituality. Take your pick. I'm one, high view of nature. So similar to this. So I relate to this question, and it's in some respects almost even more challenging sometimes trying to present the gospel to someone in this circumstance. And this would be a different approach. I mean, yeah, arguments for God may not be the starting point necessarily, although to the extent that you can get into God's attributes and the fact that God is a Trinity and those kinds of things, that might actually be relevant. But yeah, it would seem as though getting to more of the contact points with the gospel and where the way the gospel would rub against this worldview would be where the discussion would need to be pushing towards. So my approach might be to go to Jesus, because someone in this posture probably has some sort of respect for Jesus, I'm guessing. And so then C.S. Lewis's classic appeal, it really works on the street level. If Jesus said this, he claimed to be God. And going through the classic Lord, liar, lunatic, and sometimes we add on legend as a category argument, that is a lot of purchase. And then we can say, well, that's a great way to start pushing back against maybe some of the too open-ended feel of the worldviews like this, because you can say, well, Jesus said this. If we've either got to take it or leave it. And it's a way to introduce either ors where the other person might be constantly going with both ands. Because, and also this takes the pressure off of you. You can just say, look, Jesus said this. We've all got to make up our minds about what he meant and whether we believe it. But he said that. That's his claim. Whether it be, his claim to uniquely be the light of the world, the bread of life, all the unique claims he made, that might be an example of where to go. And Greg Koukl's book has some great tactics for how to press into these kinds of conversations too, that I found helpful as well.
Okay, great. All right, so if you've got any last questions, those of you who are listening in, go ahead and type them up. I'm going to do some speed round questions and just give folks a chance if they want to ask you any last questions as well. But while I've got you, so you your area of academic study is church history, and so two-part question: who's your favorite theologian of the past that you find yourself returning to, and maybe who's an underappreciated theologian that we should become aware of?
Okay. My favorite theologian is Anselm. He was a medieval theologian who came up with what's called the ontological argument. And I've just found his argument not only for God's existence, but the whole way he approaches theology to be prayerful, to be fascinating, to be kind of category expanding for me because he's medieval and he just thinks differently. Another one that's very, you mentioned kind of who's neglected or who's undervalued or something.
Yeah.
Well, I mentioned Pascal earlier. I read through Pascal's Pensées, thoughts, in preparation in the research for my apologetics book. And I really walked away saying, there's so much value in this, even if you don't agree with his approach on everything. Sometimes he's kind of caricatured, but he's got these really pithy little statements that are really useful for apologetics. So I wish more people would read Pascal.
Okay, good, interesting. What book's on your bedside table right now?
I don't have anything on my bedside table, but in terms of kind of what I have lying around over here, I'm doing some debates with Roman Catholic friends on YouTube, and I have a debate coming up with an Eastern Orthodox priest in May next month on YouTube. I'm kind of getting into YouTube right now. And so I have a bunch of books on baptism and the nature of the church, because I'm going to need to be prepared for his argument that everybody believed in baptismal regeneration until the Reformation. And I don't have a good answer yet, but I'm working on it.
Wow. Okay. Just lightly, yeah. Okay, I can understand why that's not at your bedside table, by the way.
Yeah.
And then how about just favorite movie that you return to if you do return to movies?
Yeah. I love movies. I watch movies all the time. I like dramas. Well, I like all kinds of movies, but the movie A Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe is always, I just love the story of his redemption in that. And it takes place in Princeton, and I've always found Princeton a really beautiful and interesting city. So that's a favorite. Good Will Hunting is another favorite. And lately I've been watching the Bourne movies. So I tend to go back to those ones.
Good. Okay. How would James chapter 2, so now we're back to the Bible, demonstrating the faith by good deeds fits into cultural apologetics?
Well, I'm more thinking of James 2 these days in relation to my dialogues with Roman Catholics. But so I've got to sort of switch gears mentally here to think about cultural apologetics. And I'm not sure if the question is getting at something that I may miss here. Certainly at one level, Jesus said, by this, all men will know you are my disciples if you love one another. And I do think that the greatest apologetic is always a life. I was just watching Peter Kreeft. I like Peter Kreeft. He's a philosopher. He was talking on YouTube, and he was talking about saints and how the lives of saints, there's no counter argument to the life of a saint. When you see a saint, someone who's really godly and loving, there's just no counter argument. And I had to say, I was scratching my head thinking, I think he's right. I can't think of what a good counter argument is to someone whose life is so compelling and beautiful and wonderful. So that might be one way that James 2 fits in, is it calls us to walk the walk and not just talk the talk.
Yeah, that's really good. You mentioned that there were areas of your faith that were discarded through the process of deconstruction. Would you be willing to share any of those areas and why?
Sure. The biggest one, and I don't know where the boundaries lie in terms of how this will come across, so just forgive me for the honesty, but become more open on issues of creation and evolution. So I'm still not landed. I'm not sure, but I realized that some of my objections to evolution weren't as compelling as I thought, and that caused some angst for me. And that was a experience I went through, and that was unsettling and kind of jarring. So that was one area. Another layer was kind of within the landscape of American evangelicalism, feeling some disillusionment about how many leaders had let us down, and people people I knew personally, pastors who I looked up to and thought were godly people, and then something was exposed about their life, and that's really a disillusioning experience. I have a lot of compassion for people who've been through that, like they became converted under a pastor and then the pastor later apostatizes. That's really, really hard. So those kinds of experiences as well. Those are probably the two leading things for me that cause the most amount of angst.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, thanks for sharing on both of those. Have you seen The Chosen? If so, what do you think about it?
I have a friend that I'm always talking to on Marco Polo, and he's always telling me to watch The Chosen. And I have just seen a couple of clips, and I thought they were really good. I'm not one who's really typically into Christian movies or Christian TV, but the clips I saw, which were I probably have seen like 3 different clips on YouTube, and they were all really well done. Kind of, they were imaginative, but they didn't feel cheesy, or they didn't feel like they were taking too many liberties. It felt true to the spirit of the stories. So I just have a distant impression of it, but it was a positive one.
Okay. Yeah, I'm with you. I keep hearing this, that we have to go see this. So maybe I will too. Okay. In my experience, Christian spirituality tends to be too otherworldly, maybe just too disembodied or something like that. Do you think that the church in general should affirm more of the goodness of creation? Perhaps this can help in showing the beauty of the Christian worldview. Any thoughts on that?
I'm sympathetic to what Juan brings up here. Yeah, what I mentioned a moment ago about the sacraments, and sometimes we don't have a very robust view of the sacraments, it kind of comes in here. But the other thing I think of is sometimes Christians have a sacred secular divide, and we put all of our focus upon, or we even think of like, there's spiritual activities and then there's other things. And the basic idea that the world that we inhabit, God made, it is good. And when Adam is there before the fall, he's naming the animals, he's active, he's working, and vocation. So having a robust view of vocation as a good thing, and not shying away from certain parts of culture for fear of worldliness, but rather thinking of Jesus as our model of we are supposed to not be worldly, we are supposed to be distinct, but that's in holiness, not in kind of this cultural separation. Jesus was fully engaged with sinful people. He spoke the language people spoke. He dressed like people. He didn't pull away from the world. So that's one area where I'm sure there's many other examples we could think of where I think Christians can have more of this worldly spirituality, is knowing that we are glorifying God, pleasing God, and serving God, even if our vocation isn't a pastor or a missionary or something like that. You can be a scientist, you can be a tennis teacher. There's so many different vocations by which you can bring glory to God, and know those are valid and important in his sight. You're serving him if you are faithful in those jobs. And that's something most Christians probably have heard that, but I've found as a pastor, Christians sometimes need to be encouraged in those ways.
Yeah, that's really great. All right, we've got one more. Vote for The Chosen is a great series. So thank you. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to give the last question, and then we can wrap up here. Gavin, thank you so much. This has been just super encouraging to hear kind of your faith journey and your wisdom and the kinds of things you're thinking and writing about. And so really appreciate your time. As a pastor, this is the last question, maybe, and you can give any last word you'd like on this. Real concerned about, in general, the lack or the basic sort of rampant anti-intellectualism that we have in American evangelicalism, and perhaps some of the responsibility that lays on the pastors that shepherd our flocks week in after week out. You, on the other hand, are an example of a pastor scholar. And so maybe any thoughts on sort of finding that balance, head and heart? I mean, it's not a false dichotomy, it's both and, but robust life of the mind, nurturing the heart as well. How do you sort of approach that question in light of this sort of rampant anti-intellectualism that I think we struggle as a church today?
Well, perhaps because of the YouTube debates I'm doing, it's made me more aware of how many people in our culture are looking for that intellectual and historical rigor and depth and philosophical rigor. I get emails every day, almost, from people who are considering moving from an evangelical context to a Roman Catholic context or an Eastern Orthodox context. And I think one of the big draws is uh, there is at least a perceived greater kind of intellectual tradition uh, there, and people are really attracted to that. And so it's just been on my mind. Okay, what do I do about that? And uh, so one of my concerns is to encourage evangelical Protestants. Um, we can sometimes be tempted toward a more pragmatic expression of the church, and it can be more shallow. And I think, I don't want to try. Sometimes evangelicals are really easy to criticize too much. There's some wonderful things about how evangelicals, like the instincts of evangelicals to try to make the gospel clear and things like this. That's wonderful. But I think just the general burden and conviction that's been forming in me that I had before, but it's been deepened by these experiences with so many evangelicals leaving Protestantism or deconstructing altogether. And it has been that we should not hold back at all in going for intellectual depth in our liturgy, whatever that expression of worship is, in our sermons, in our personal lives, in our study. Rigorous, uh, deep thinking is never the problem, and it is often a great help. And if people perceive our expression of church or Christianity to be shallow, they might tolerate it for a while, but eventually they're going to go looking for something that's more deep and really speaks to the complicated problems of the world and the complicated problems of our lives. So I don't have a great answer other than just to assert and reemphasize the need to pursue that rigor and pursue that depth. Um, the work that you do, Paul, at teaching, that training people in philosophy, for example. I mean, that'd be an example of an area where evangelicals historically probably haven't done as well as Catholics, is philosophy. I mean, some evangelicals have, but just as a general compare, or historical, church history, my field. Certainly, I'm reading Anselm. I wrote my dissertation on Anselm. Of the many, many books I'm looking at, I think there was only one written by an evangelical. I mean, it was all written by Catholics, secular historians, and Bardians. A few Bardians in there, but mainly just Catholics. And so it's like, that's not good. So as evangelicals, it seems as though they were kind of in reckoning days right now, amongst many other things we need. One of them, it seems, is deeper historical study and inquiry. And it's not the solution to everything, but it's something we need to think about a lot, I think.
Awesome. Okay. Very good. Well, Gavin, thank you so much for your time, and everybody, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And for those of you who have joined us throughout the month, we really appreciate you guys and all your great questions too. Today we were all over, Gavin. So well done, man. That was that was fun. Just so you guys know, all of these videos will be posted shortly on the Mars Hill Exchange website, which is at twotasksinstitute.org. And so there will be a chance for you to pass this on to your friends, to watch it on YouTube or link to it as well. And so stay tuned for that. But if you have any questions, you can feel free to email the twotasksinstitute@gmail.com. Or there's also an email that goes out after this where you can give feedback. And if you have any questions, you want to get in touch with myself or Gavin or any of these speakers, we'd be happy to field those questions for you. So blessings, Gavin. Great to see you in Ojai. And thanks for giving us your dinner hour today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Paul. And thanks everybody for the great questions.
You're welcome. Awesome. Okay. Blessings all. Blessings, Gavin. And we'll see you guys next time. Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.